So in the aftermath of any large-scale, regional, or even global disaster, one of the most useful lifelines in this scenario may also be one of the greatest threats. The most sophisticated and capable group in the aftermath of a grid-down situation is going to be what remains of the government and its many appendages. This governing force may be legitimate or illegitimate. It may be there to help you or to exploit you. The reality is, excessive use of force, or martial law, will be an inevitable phase of the collapse. Don't forget that you can show your support for the After the Collapse series by liking, commenting, and sharing these videos on other social media platforms. Enjoy the video. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the term without rule of law. What this essentially is meant to denote is the idea that after a large-scale disaster situation, emergency services will have reached their capacity at being able to manage all the incidents which arise, and at some point or another, they're no longer going to be able to effectively respond and control the situation, which will probably mark a descent into full-blown anarchy, which may be short-lived or long-lived depending on the nature of the disaster situation. Now, excessive rule of law is the complete opposite of without rule of law, and it is an attempt to restore rule of law in most cases, but then again, it's also the same tactic which has been used to suppress populations by tyrants throughout the ages. So as it may be a valid tool to try to restore law and order, it can also be abused, and typically in some way, shape, or form it inevitably will be abused if martial law is enacted and people's constitutional rights are suspended. Now, if you look at the timeline of events of any regional disaster situation, typically they follow the same pattern. And I'm going to expound on this in much greater detail, but basically what happens is that there's a big disaster, emergency services cannot respond, people start panicking, it descends into lawlessness, and in an attempt to bring law and order back into the situation, excessive force is used in an attempt to try to deter some of that chaos from getting worse. And it's important to understand also that if we're talking about a long-term situation, rule of law may be enforced by private entities or self-proclaimed leaders, illegitimate despots or governing bodies who've basically just put themselves in a position of power against the will of the people. Take for an example, there was a community which could no longer enforce the rule of law and some gang came to power. There still probably would be some unspoken, unwritten rules there. Of course, they would be ruled with an iron fist, and law would not be applied fairly or appropriately. So in any community, you can have order to such an extent that people are able to survive and even thrive to some degree, but order doesn't necessarily entail justice. Justice, as it's commonly understood, is a luxury which is only afforded by the individual rights and freedoms which are protected by the current existing rule of law. Now, it should be known that all levels of law enforcement, be they the police, private security that is contracted by the police or the government, the Coast Guard, the United States military, or the Canadian equivalents thereof, they have protocols in place to protect the critical infrastructure sectors of society. Now, a few examples of these critical areas of infrastructure in no particular order of importance, although as I've seen in the past in some papers that I've read, there has been a priority list, and that priority list is going to differ depending on which country you're in and what that country deems as most necessary to its functioning. So some of these are as follows: government facilities, transportation systems, communication systems, information technology, nuclear reactors, material and waste, emergency services, that should go without saying, dams, critical manufacturing, commercial facilities would probably be further down on the list, chemical manufacturing and warehousing plants, water, banking and finance, healthcare and public health, energy, agriculture and food, and of course the industrial base of whatever military that country might possess, as that may be the only way that they can ensure their own security as a nation in the years following any disaster, or if there was some sort of enduring conflict in particular. Now, this is my own meta-analysis of how a disaster timeline would ensue, and it's based on some of the amateur research that I've done, and I'm going to relate it all to the progression of excessive rule of law, or martial law as it's commonly understood. So the first phase of disaster is going to be the pre-disaster phase. So disaster may be gradual or it may be sudden. Now usually there's going to be some knowledge that something will happen, except in the case of, sudden weather anomalies, terrorist attacks, or large-scale active shooter scenarios as we've seen in the recent weeks. Now it's important to understand that there's always going to be a discrepancy between what the media or the powers that be actually know and what they're telling you. So while they might know that there's a disaster that is imminent, they may not tell you for the sake of preventing panic and trying to maintain order. Now the timeline for this is going to vary significantly. So this could be something as short as a mutually assured destruction global nuclear exchange with the superpowers of the world launching all their missiles at one another. Or this could be something that was far more drawn out, like a pandemic scenario, which could go on for years. In such case, if it did go on for years, you're going to see a much more refined state of martial law than would be characterized by the typical hard-lined, iron-fisted justice that we commonly associate martial law with. Now, it's important to understand that the media is the first line of defense and offense for a country's military. The whole point of propaganda is to control the minds of the people so that you have to do less fighting and expend less resources on fighting. So controlling public opinion through propaganda and orders through the emergency broadcast system will likely be used in an attempt to quell any civil unrest that might ensue. So it's very crucial that prior to a disaster or in the initial phases of a disaster that you are very critical of the instructions that you were given. While they may in the off chance save your life, these messages are intended to serve the primary purpose of pacifying the masses as a whole. They are not necessarily there for your own individual personal security. And just the simple fact that one general message is being given out to every single person, regardless of location, what resources you have at your disposal, and all the other extraneous variables that might come into play, that should tell you with absolute certainty that these messages are not to serve the benefit of the individual, rather they're geared towards the preservation of the greater good or the public as a whole. So whether or not you want to blindly follow those orders is up to you, but I would encourage you to be very skeptical because their main function is to maintain law and order, not to keep you alive. Now, it's important to note that throughout the pre-disaster phase, if the media is incapable of placating the masses, then the pre-disaster environment can come to resemble the post-disaster environment in a without rule of law sense, as a situation like this can quickly deteriorate into full-blown anarchy. In such case, there will be a smooth transition into Phase 3. If the public panic is able to be alleviated, we move on to Phase 2. Now, the second phase is the disaster phase. Now, this is the point, obviously, disaster hits, people are displaced, many people are hunkering down, many people are hiding, and in this phase, people are just in survival mode. They're not quite in that scavenging or salvage mode just yet. Now, depending on the scope of the disaster and how long it lasts, this phase, once again, may be ongoing, and it may not be an isolated event. It may be a series of smaller, less intense events, as I said, in the instance of a pandemic, or even an EMP, which could be triggered by a nuclear exchange or a solar flare. Now, isolated and localized events, of course, would follow more predictable trajectories. Now, something that I originally heard K-Goat talk about was the fog of SHTF, and that's going to ensue immediately after disaster. Basically, what this is it's the lack of information about what has happened, or the extent of the damage that's been done, how long it will persist, and what help may or may not be coming your way. Now, chances are attempts will be made by the many modalities of the emergency alert systems that are in place to notify the public of the state of the disaster, but once again, this information may be misleading and have the primary purpose of maintaining the social order and not maintaining your individual safety. Now, at this point, law enforcement might take some drastic measures and utter some pretty serious threats of repercussions for people who do get out of line at this point, just because they know that at this point people are still conditioned to trust the law, or at least fear the law. Quickly that is going to break down as we're going to talk to in the next phases. But in the most acute phases of disaster, people will still be very compliant, and in many cases people will be looking for help. People will not be trying to avoid the police and the emergency responders. The reality is people will be trying to get help. Every disaster of the 20th century has proven this, whether it's been 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina. First thing people do is put up a help sign. Now, a society's critical infrastructure resiliency and the scope of the disaster will determine how much martial enforcement would have to be implemented in order to bring in law and order. Now, in order to effectively predict when things are going to get out of control, you need to understand the capacity of your emergency response system in your area in order to respond to the calls for help they get. And right now, especially in places where it's publicly funded, most of these emergency response systems are functioning always at capacity or just under capacity. So it only takes a very small disaster to easily overwhelm an emergency services department. So there's three types of capacity that characterize an emergency system. So the first type is the absorptive capacity. Now this is the degree to which a system can automatically absorb the impact of system perturbations and minimize these consequences. So basically this is what your local law enforcement, fire department, and paramedics can accomplish when everybody shows up to work that day. Now the next capacity is the adaptive capacity. Now this is a system's ability to function with a little bit of extra effort, some ingenuity, and the ability to exhaust all of its redundant systems. So most emergency management systems are going to have some degree of redundancy and preparations put aside for cases of extreme crisis. So this is really that system's ability to function dynamically without the need for external assistance from federal resources or even international. Really what this does is stretch resources to the fullest extent possible. So you're going to have people working double, maybe triple shifts. You're going to be warehousing people in the hospitals. It's going to be wall-to-wall chaos. Now, the restorative capacity of a system is the ability of a system or rule of law to be restored with the help of some external force. So in order for a system to have some sort of restorative capacity, it would necessitate that the disaster probably was regional at best in scope. If it was national, chances are federal resources would be spread out so thin, states, counties, provinces, townships would be left to their own devices to fend for themselves and come up with their own innovative ways to mitigate these issues. Now the third phase is the interesting phase, and this really is the shit hits the fan phase.